Hey guys, in this video we're going to be covering everything you need to know for Module 7 Ecology. We're going to be looking at how those ecosystems are organised, how nutrients are cycled through those ecosystems, how we can investigate ecosystems, and how humans impact ecosystems. Don't forget to check out the link down below to access your free flashcards to study this module. All you got to do is enter your details and they'll be sent to you immediately. Also, check out the link for my resources where you can access all of the study notes that you need for free to help you revise for your exams. Also, check out the link to sign up to my exam masterclasses where you can get all of the revision you need the night before your exam. All right, let's get to the video. When it comes to ecology, the first thing to know is various key terms. And we're going to use these key terms throughout this video and all the way through this module and in exam questions. So we need to be really clued up on what each of these terms means. The first one is an ecosystem. Now, an ecosystem is the interaction of a community of living organisms, the biotic part, with the non-living, the abiotic parts of their environment. Now, the non-living parts of their environment might be things like the habitat, the rocks that they live under. It might also be things like the temperature of the environment that they live in as well. More on biotic and abiotic factors to come. Next, we have a population, and this is all of the organisms of one species living in a habitat. Think about our definition of a species, a group of organisms that are able to interbreed to produce fertile offspring. A population will be able to interbreed, and it's within a single area. Next, we have a community, and this is all of the different species living in a habitat. This could be the animal species and the plant species, along with all of the bacterial species, the decomposers, the fungi as well. We also have interdependence, and this is how organisms in a community rely on each other for things like food, shelter, pollination, and seed dispersal. The plants rely on the animals for pollination and seed dispersal, and the animals rely on the plants for food and for shelter. We also have competition. Competition is the struggle between organisms to get enough resources to survive and reproduce. All organisms are in competition with each other. Our abiotic factors are our non-living parts of the ecosystem, for example, our light, temperature, or moisture. More examples to follow. And biotic factors are the living parts of an ecosystem. For example, the predators, the food availability, potentially the pathogens as well. And the habitat is the place where an organism lives. A habitat could be living or non-living. A habitat could be a tree, for example, or a habitat could be some rocks. We also have a stable community. A stable community is one where the population sizes and the environmental conditions remain relatively constant over a longer period of time. A stable community is able to resist change, and stable communities come about from high biodiversity, but more about biodiversity later on in the video. So competition can occur between different species or between individuals of the same species. When organisms are competing, there are a limited number of resources available within the habitat. There is a finite number. If there is competition, if the resources are plentiful, and there is reduced competition, this means more organisms will survive and reproduce, meaning the population size can increase. A larger population is supported by the ecosystem. If there is a limited number of resources, then there is going to be increased competition for those resources. Only the better adapted individuals will survive and reproduce, and so the population may decrease. This is also one of the driving forces of natural selection. So, what do organisms compete for? Well, animals may compete for food, they may compete for water, perhaps mates if they are the same species. They might also compete for space or territory, or perhaps shelter. What do plants compete for? Well, plants will compete for space, taller will compete for light, taller plants getting access to more light. They will compete for space. If the plant has access to more space, it has access to more mineral ions, for example. They will compete for water. Plants that are crowded in close together will have to share the same amount of water, which means they will get less water. And they will also compete for mineral ions in the soil. If the plants are crowded together, they will get less of those mineral ions. Better adapted individuals are more likely to survive because they are going to outcompete other individuals. Next, we can talk about our biotic and abiotic factors affecting an ecosystem or a community.
Now, these abiotic and biotic factors are things that will affect population size. Our abiotic factors are the non-living factors. Examples of abiotic factors are light intensity, temperature, moisture levels, the soil pH and mineral content, the wind intensity and the direction, the carbon dioxide concentrations, and perhaps the oxygen concentrations for an aquatic ecosystem. Now, these abiotic factors, we need to be able to explain how each of these might affect the population, why it might affect the growth of an individual. So light intensity we can directly link to photosynthesis, temperature we can link to photosynthesis or other enzyme controlled reactions, moisture levels we can link to transpiration and water loss, soil pH and mineral content we can link to the availability of minerals for producing things like chlorophyll or the effect of pH on enzymes, wind intensity and direction we can link to transpiration, carbon dioxide concentrations we can link to perhaps rates of photosynthesis, and oxygen concentrations in aquatic ecosystems we can link to rates of respiration. But if we imagine a population of rabbits, why would light intensity affect a population of rabbits? Well, if there is a reduced light intensity, there is going to be reduced photosynthesis, which means there is reduced growth of plants. And if there's reduced growth of plants, there's then less food available for the rabbits. So this brings us into our biotic factors. The biotic factors are the living components of an ecosystem. These might be the number of predators, the diseases caused by pathogens, competition between species, availability of food or prey, the number of herbivores, or maybe the shade provided by the trees or the shelter. Now, these biotic factors, we also need to think about how this affects the population size. Obviously, the number of predators means that there's more animals being eaten, and that reduces the population. If there's increasing disease, there's increased death, and that reduces the population as well. We can think about the availability of food. If there's more food available, then a larger population can be supported because there is less competition. If we think about the shade provided by the trees, if there's more places to shelter, then there's more available habitats for the population of organisms within that ecosystem. So what makes an organism adapted to its environment? Well, there are three types of adaptations. They can either be structural, functional, or behavioral. Now, a structural adaptation is the features, the physical features of an organism's body. This might be things like thick fur or the spines of a cactus. Behavioral adaptations are the way the organism acts. So these might be things like migration or hibernation. Functional adaptations are adaptations that happen within the body. So these could be desert animals producing concentrated urine, for example, or perhaps animals that are venomous or toxic. Let's look at some specific examples of some environments and how organisms are adapted for those environments. So our first environment are cold environments. Now, organisms living in this environment, they tend to have thick fur. Now, the thick fur makes them adapted because it reduces the loss of thermal energy. It acts as an insulating layer, and that increases the distance that the thermal energy has to pass before it can be transferred to the air surrounding the animal. They also have blubber or a thick layer of fat, again acting as an insulating layer, reducing the loss of thermal energy. They also have a small surface area to volume ratio. They have small ears, they have small limbs. This makes them more kind of round and larger bodies as well. This reduces their heat loss because the surface area to volume ratio is smaller. They also tend to be white in colour. This makes them camouflage, which makes them either adapted for hunting or perhaps adapted for kind of escaping predators and hiding from predators as well. Now, in hot or dry environments, we tend to see the opposite. We tend to see animals that have a large surface area to volume ratio. They might have large ears, they might have long, thin legs, and this increases their surface area compared to their volume, which increases the exchange of thermal energy. They also might be nocturnal. If they are nocturnal, this would be a behavioral adaptation, and they are then out and active at night when it is cooler. They also might produce concentrated urine. The concentrated urine is a functional adaptation. It is happening inside the body, and this is reducing water loss. We also see adaptations in things like camels. Camels have wide feet to stop them sinking into the sand. It increases the surface area. We also see this in cold environments. Polar bears, for example, have very, very wide feet as well. Next, we've got the desert plants. Now, cacti are a good example of a plant that is adapted for a desert. Desert plants tend to have a thick, waxy cuticle. That thick, waxy cuticle prevents water loss and prevents the plant from drying out. They might have small or few leaves, and this is going to reduce the number of stomata, again reducing transpiration and the rate of water loss. They might also have very wide, deep roots so that they can access more water, and so the plant is able to access more water. They also might have things like spines. This might be a structural adaptation. The spines of the cacti are there to prevent the cacti from being eaten by herbivores. And lastly, we have extremophiles. Extremophiles are organisms that are adapted to live in extreme environments. These usually tend to be things like bacteria and archaea. Now, these are animals that live in very, very high temperature environments, or they live in very, very salty or very low or high pH environments. Places like thermal vents around the kind of bottom of the ocean. So how do we represent the interactions within a ecosystem? We use food chains and food webs. So a food chain shows the flow of energy through an ecosystem. Sometimes it can be showing the flow of biomass as well. Primarily though, the arrows represent the flow of energy. So where does that energy come from initially? Well, the energy comes from the sun. The first part of a food chain is the producer. The producer is usually a plant because it is going to be photosynthesizing, which means it is converting the light energy into a chemical energy store. That chemical energy store is then used for respiration, but also to produce things like proteins to be able to grow. Those proteins, the biomass of that first trophic level where the grass is then passed to the next level. This we call the primary consumer. The rabbit is an example of a primary consumer. It is eating the producer and the biomass is transferred to the rabbit. The rabbit is then eaten by the fox, which is an example of a secondary consumer. We can also have tertiary consumers and very rarely a quaternary consumer. The very top of the food chain is often referred to as an apex predator. Now, food chains are a simplification of the entire ecosystem. A food web shows many connected food chains within the same ecosystem. It shows how different organisms are more interdependent on each other. So for example here we can see that the plants are eaten by the aphids, the moth larvae and the vole. But the moth larvae are eaten by the blue tits and by the spider. And the owl has three main food sources: the blue tits, the chiffchaffs and the vole. Chiffchaffs are an example of a bird. We need to be able to interpret these food chains. Let's imagine a farmer used a pesticide that killed off the aphids. How would this affect the populations of other animals in this food chain? Well, if there were fewer aphids, this means that the ladybird population would decrease, which means that the blue tit is going to start consuming more of the moth larvae potentially in order to sustain the population. If more of the moth larvae are consumed, their population will decrease, meaning that the population of spiders might decrease and the population of chiffchaffs might decrease. This means overall there is less food available for the owl, so the population of the owls might decrease. But this might mean that the population of voles can now increase, and so the population of the stoats might also increase. Notice all of the knock-on consequences here in these food chains. Remember, with our food chains, it's really important we get the arrows the right way round. It shows the flow of energy from the earlier level to the next level. Lots of students put them the wrong way round and put them basically going to the left. Predators and prey form an important part of food chains. Predators are animals that will hunt and kill another animal. Prey are the animals that are hunted by the predators. The predator and the prey have some key adaptations. Predators tend to have sharp teeth and claws to help catch the prey. They have forward-facing eyes to give them better depth perception, and they tend to have fast and agile bodies. They have good senses and are quite often camouflaged so that the prey don't see them. They sometimes have venom as well in order to help them kill their prey. The prey also have a range of adaptations in order to prevent being caught by the predator. An example of this is eyes on the side of their head. This gives them a larger field of view, meaning that they are more likely to spot the predators from coming. Prey quite often are also camouflaged to hide from the predators. They are quite fast and agile to escape the predator. And they often live in groups and herds. This is the safety in numbers idea. This means they can help to spot predators sooner, but it can also overwhelm the predator, and the predator is then less successful in catching an individual. They also tend to have warning signals as they work together. They might start to call to each other to say that a predator is near. The prey may also have warning colours to the predator. They might have colours that display to the predator, and the predator then recognises that individual as being toxic or poisonous. Sometimes they are also mimic. They also mimic other animals. By mimicking other animals, what they are doing is they are trying to express to the predator that they might be toxic or poisonous because they look like another one that might be, and the predator is then less likely to eat them. We can think about predator and prey populations existing in a cycle. We can see in the graph here that the prey population generally is always greater than the predator population. The grey line is usually higher than the orange line. We can also see that initially the prey population starts to decrease. Now, as the prey population starts to increase, we can then see there is more food available for the predators. So the number of predators starts to increase. If the number of predators start to increase, this means we are then going to get a decrease in the prey because there is more predation taking place. If there's more predation, the population decreases, which means there is then less food available, which means the number of predators then decreases. And if the number of predators decreases, well, this means that there's less predation, meaning that the population of the prey now increases. And so we get this cycle forming, and it will repeat again and again. This will remain relatively stable over a long period of time, unless a new predator is introduced into that ecosystem. If a new predator is introduced into the ecosystem, then the predation of the prey will increase and the population might decrease even further, meaning it is then unable to support the other predator population. So how do we investigate an ecosystem? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to sample it. Why do we use sampling? It's not possible to count every organism within an area. Sampling allows us to estimate population sizes and also see how organisms are distributed. It also helps us to see the effect of certain abiotic and biotic factors. There are a few ways that we can sample an ecosystem, but one of the main ways is we can use a quadrat. A quadrat is a square frame, maybe made of metal, maybe it's made of wood. Now, this square frame gives us a specific area in which we will count our target species. Now, it's important when we're sampling that it's representative of the entire ecosystem, so we need to remove any bias. How do we do that? We are going to randomly place our quadrats. By randomly placing them, we are avoiding any bias and we're avoiding any kind of intention from the researcher or from the student. How do we assign them randomly? Well, we're going to have to assign random coordinates, but more about that when we look at estimating a population next. Now, how do we use a quadrat? Well, we're going to first place the quadrat on the ground. By placing the quadrat on the ground, we can then see what is within that area. There are two types of quadrats. We might use an open quadrat like the image on the left, or we might use a grid quadrat like on the right. And when we are looking at the quadrat, we might count the number of individuals to determine the population. We might also count the number of different types of individuals. So the number of types of flowers or the number of which species is present. But sometimes it might be hard to distinguish the difference between individual organisms. Imagine trying to count all of the individual blades of grass. In that instance, we might use something like on the right-hand side. Now we can see on the right-hand side here that some of these squares are covered with the kind of green grass. Now we can see we have numbered them up to 13 here. The reason why we've done that is because we want to stay consistent with which squares we are counting. Take this square here, for example. We can see that approximately half of the square, slightly more than half of the square, is covered by the brown. Whereas if we look at number 9 here, we can see that less than half of the square is covered by the brown, more than half of the square is covered by the green. We just want to make sure that we are consistent every time we use these quadrats. So every time we are going to say, if more than half the square is covered, we will count that square. And then we are just going to determine what is the percentage cover of this quadrat. So there are 13 squares that are covered with the green grass, and we are going to divide that by the 25 squares in total. Multiply that by 100, and we get a final answer of 52%. This is our percentage cover of an area. So how can we estimate the size of a population? Well, we can do it in a few simple steps. Firstly, we're going to place the quadrats randomly in the study area to avoid any bias. To do this, we're going to draw a grid over the map of the area and assign coordinates. A random number generator can then be used to select the coordinates that we will sample. We place the quadrat at the sample site and we count the number of individuals in each quadrat. Then calculate the mean number of organisms per quadrat. We're going to want to use many repeats for this. Multiply the mean number per meter squared. Now there's an important thing to recognize here, that sometimes we might get a quadrat that is not 1 meter by 1 meter. Sometimes they might be half a meter by half a meter, in which case the area of this quadrat is 0.25 meters squared. And so to work out the mean number per quadrat, the mean number per meter squared, I would want to take my mean number per quadrat and divide it by the area of the quadrat. So dividing by 0.25. And this will give me my mean number per meter squared. That's an important thing to watch out for. Examiners like to trip people up with that. And then we're going to multiply this by the total area size of the habitat to estimate the whole population. There's going to be lots of variation using this, so we want to use many quadrats, at least 10. This will make the estimate more representative of the true population size. What about if the distribution of an organism changes throughout a habitat? For example, how the distribution of flowers changes moving away from the shade of a tree. Well, to do that, we are going to need to use a transect to investigate this distribution. A transect is very simply a line through an ecosystem. It's a single line along which we are going to take samples using a quadrat to count the number of individuals. How do we use a transect? First, we are going to stretch a tape measure between 2 points. Now, these 2 points will be away from an abiotic factor. So, for example, away from a tree. We're going to place the quadrats at regular intervals along the line, for example, every 1 meter. This is systematic sampling. This is not random. We are not placing the quadrat at random positions along the transect. We are going to count or record the species within each quadrat, and we are also going to measure the abiotic factor, for example, the light intensity. This then allows us to produce a graph where we can have along the x-axis the distance along the transect and the number or the frequency along the y-axis. We can then see how the number changes with distance. As well as putting distance on the x-axis, we could put the abiotic factor. We could perhaps put the light intensity on the x-axis, and we will see how the number changes as we move away from that abiotic factor. Now, it's important to repeat this transect as well. we would want to repeat the transect parallel to the first transect and then place the quadrats at the same intervals along the transect. So there's a lot of things going on here. We've got quadrats and we've got transects. Remember, the quadrat is the metal frame and the quadrat is used to sample the area. The quadrat can be used to estimate the population size, or the quadrat can be used with a transect to investigate the distribution of a species. And the transect is just the line through an ecosystem. As well as thinking about how to investigate an ecosystem, we need to think about how ecosystems are affected. One of the first ways that an ecosystem is affected is by the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle describes how carbon moves through different places within an ecosystem. Our first position of, or where we're going to start our carbon cycle, is with the carbon dioxide in the air. Now, it's important to recognize that we are talking about carbon dioxide here. Carbon dioxide in the air is taken into plants by photosynthesis. The plants convert that carbon into other carbon-containing compounds, such as carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. These carbon-based compounds can then be passed on to animals through feeding. The animals will use these carbon-based compounds to grow, but they will also use them to respire. And as they produce carbon dioxide, this is released into the atmosphere. The plants are also respiring, so are also releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as well. The plants and the animals will die, they will also produce waste material, and this dead and waste material is then going to be decomposed. As it is decomposed, the decomposers will break down those organic compounds, the carbon-containing compounds, and use them to respire. When they respire, they are going to be producing carbon dioxide, which again releases the carbon into the atmosphere. If those organisms do not decompose, and this is in very, very rare conditions, they may form fossil fuels. But this takes millions of years. The fossil fuels that we have today are the remains of organisms from millions of years ago. But these fossil fuels are being dug up and they are being burnt. This is a process of combustion. The combustion burns the carbon-based compounds in the fossil fuels and releases carbon dioxide, which contributes to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. When we talk about the carbon cycle, we need to think about how it might be affected by human activity. So, for example, human activity of burning fossil fuels increases the amount of carbon dioxide. But what about the removal of plants? Removal of plants through processes like deforestation will then reduce the amount of photosynthesis. This will decrease the amount of carbon dioxide being removed from the air. But those deforested plants, those cut down plants, will then contribute to more dead organic material, which then contributes to more decomposition, which again is going to increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the air. Human activity can have a serious consequence on these carefully balanced environmental cycles. Another example of an environmental cycle or a nutrient cycle is the water cycle. The water cycle describes how water moves through an ecosystem. One of the main sources of water are bodies of water. These might be things like the seas, oceans, lakes perhaps as well. The water evaporates from these large bodies of water as they warm up. This then produces clouds as the water condenses in the atmosphere. And then we get precipitation. Precipitation might be rain, it could also be things like snow and hail as well. This returns the water to the land. The water then runs off the land. It might also percolate down through the land as well. So we might also see some infiltration as the water goes into groundwater stores. As the water runs off, it is then absorbed by the trees. And as it is absorbed by the trees, it moves through the trees and is released back into the atmosphere through transpiration as it evaporates out of the stomata. This process of the water cycle is how the water is being recycled through the atmosphere. One of the key things that students forget is the role of transpiration as part of the water cycle. Don't forget the factors affecting transpiration and how this will then impact the rest of the water cycle as well. Next, we move on to biodiversity. Thinking about ecosystems, a good, stable community has a lot of different types of species living within it. They are all interdependent and they all rely on each other for different things. Biodiversity means the variety of all the different species of plants, animals, fungi, and microorganisms on Earth or in a specific ecosystem. Biodiversity is super important. It makes ecosystems more stable. High biodiversity reduces dependence on just one species, and it also helps to maintain the physical environment by regulating and contributing to things like the carbon cycle and the water cycle. But humans also rely on high biodiversity. Humans rely on biodiversity for things like food, for medicine, clean air, and for water. If biodiversity is damaged, then the ecosystem can collapse, and this then reduces our access to vital resources. Remember, most sources of medicines come from the natural world in the first instance. And also, animals are needed for things like pollination to be able to produce lots of our food. But humans can have an impact on biodiversity as well. Human activity such as deforestation, pollution, hunting and overfishing, and climate change can reduce biodiversity. Deforestation, for example, removes habitats and so reduces the amount of available space for organisms to survive and to live, and so reduces population sizes and reduces the diversity of species as well. Pollution, such as dumping waste, chemicals, or plastics, can harm the animals and the plants. Hunting and overfishing can lead to the species becoming extinct by removing their population, by reducing their population size. Climate change can also affect populations. More on climate change in a minute, but climate change as a result of burning fossil fuels, this adds carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and this can lead to global warming, which can then destroy habitats. But humans can also have a positive impact on biodiversity. It is our responsibility to maintain the biodiversity that we are negatively impacting. Conservation maintains or increases biodiversity in ecosystems. Different examples of conservation can include things like breeding programs. So, for example, breeding programs for endangered species within zoos or within national parks. Protecting and regenerating rare habitats like wetlands, coral reefs, or ancient woodlands. In providing new habitats, for example, reintroducing field margins and hedgerows. New habitats will then increase the biodiversity, but also reducing deforestation and reducing pollution by recycling resources can reduce our negative impact on biodiversity. Conservation is super important because once a species has gone extinct, it has gone forever. Maintaining the biodiversity protects the ecosystems that humans rely on. Let's take a look in more detail at how human activity can affect and pollute environments. There are three types of pollution. Our first one is water pollution. Water pollution might be things like sewage or perhaps fertilizers that are used to increase the growth of crops, but also toxic chemicals and perhaps plastic pollution or just litter as well. Now, the water pollution damages the aquatic ecosystem and so makes it harder for organisms to survive in that ecosystem. Fertilizers have a slightly different effect on the ecosystem. As the fertilizer runs off the farm or leaches through the groundwater, this then causes algal blooms. The fertilizers are nutrients that are needed by plants. Increasing amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus in the water increases the growth of algae. This algal bloom sits on the surface of the water, and this is then going to block the light. Because the light is blocked, this means that the plants underneath the surface are going to die and start to decay. Bacteria called decomposers use up the oxygen as they decay the dead plants. Because the oxygen has then been used up, the fish then die as well, due to a lack of respiration or due to a lack of oxygen for respiration. This then leads to death of the entire ecosystem. We also have air pollution. Air pollution could be, for example, smoke or other acidic gases produced through combustion of different fuels. but also the production of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Now, smoke from burning fossil fuels can produce particulates that can cause breathing problems such as asthma in humans. The acidic gases such as sulfur dioxide or oxides of nitrogen from burning coal can mix with the rainwater to produce acid rain. Now, acid rain damages the leaves and it causes the acidification of lakes. It lowers the pH of the water, which can kill the fish. And lastly, we have land pollution. Now, land pollution is caused by dumping waste or chemicals on the ground. Land pollution is primarily seen in things like landfill sites, where waste is not recycled, but also the release of toxic chemicals onto the land. Now, landfill sites are where large amounts of household waste end up. This can leak chemicals into the soil and groundwater. Methane is also released from the landfill sites as the food scraps and other organic material are degraded, and methane is a potent greenhouse gas. Toxic chemicals such as industrial waste and pesticide, this can then end up on the land harming the plants and the animals. And these chemicals can stay for a very, very long time, affecting the ecosystems for years to come. Poor management of these different forms of pollution can then lead to a reduction in biodiversity, disrupting the food chains. Waste needs to be properly treated, recycled if possible, and firstly, using fewer chemicals wherever possible as well. Let's take a look at a specific example of an ecosystem that is at risk. These are peat bogs. Now, a peat bog is a type of wetland made up of partly decayed plants, mostly mosses, that build up over thousands of years in waterlogged acidic conditions. Good examples of peat bogs are found in places like Scotland and places like Yorkshire. Peat bogs are very, very unique habitats that support a lot of plant diversity as well as animal diversity. But the peat bogs are destroyed. The peat bogs are destroyed when the peat is drained and dug up to make compost or burnt as fuel. The compost provides useful nutrients to growing plants that the decaying material contains. But this then removes that decaying material from the ecosystem. When it is drained, the area of land is then also used for agriculture. The destruction of the peat bogs removes the habitats, so it reduces the biodiversity. It then reduces the number of available habitats for different birds or animal species and other plant species as well. The peat is also a huge carbon store. The partially decayed material contains a lot of carbon. When the peat bog is drained, it is exposed to the air and starts to decay, releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The carbon dioxide is also produced when the peat is burnt as well, further increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The destruction of the peat bogs has global consequences because it all contributes towards global warming through the production of these greenhouse gases. Let's take a look at deforestation in a bit more detail too. Deforestation is the large-scale removal of forests, especially in tropical areas. Deforestation happens for a number of different reasons. It's primarily to make space for different land use. This might be to provide land for cattle ranching, or to provide land for rice fields. It could be to grow crops to produce biofuels. Now, a biofuel is a living material that is then burnt in order to release that energy. So these are crops that are then burnt to provide fuel. The wood could be used to make paper or to provide timber for furniture and for building, or the land could just be used for urbanization to provide more housing perhaps. All of these reasons for deforestation lead to the same outcome. It reduces biodiversity. By removing the forests, we are reducing the number of habitats that are available, meaning that fewer species can be supported by that ecosystem, and so the diversity decreases. But deforestation also has other effects. It means there are fewer plants, and if there are fewer plants, there is less photosynthesis, which means less carbon is removed from the atmosphere. The burning of the trees, or the biofuels, also releases carbon dioxide, and this then contributes to more carbon being in the atmosphere. And finally, as those trees are cut down, large parts of the tree are left to decay, and that decay will again release carbon into the atmosphere as well. And finally, we come to global warming. Now, global warming is caused by greenhouse gases. The production of greenhouse gases has increased as human activity has increased. Things like the burning of fossil fuels contributes to more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Examples of greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide, methane, water vapour, and nitrous oxide. Now, it is primarily the carbon dioxide that humans produce through combustion, deforestation, and other activity that is leading towards increased climate change and global warming. So how does carbon dioxide lead towards global warming? Well, the radiation is coming from the sun. Some of the radiation is absorbed by the Earth's surface and it warms it. Then the solar radiation is reflected by the Earth and the atmosphere. Some of the radiation that is reflected passes through the atmosphere and passes back out into space. But some is absorbed by the greenhouse gases, and that is absorbed by the greenhouse gases is re-emitted back into the atmosphere. The effect of this is to warm the Earth's surface and the lower atmosphere, and so the Earth gets hotter as a result. The consequences of this are things like the ice melting. Because the ice melts in places like the Arctic and the Antarctic and also glaciers, this is then leading to sea levels rising and the flooding of low-lying areas. It is also removing the habitats of Arctic and Antarctic animals. The warmer oceans are expanding, again rising sea levels, leading to coastal flooding, again destroying habitats. It also leads to climate change. We see more extreme weather, such as heat waves, storms, droughts, and floods. There is a loss of habitats from all of these different changes, and this can then lead to a change in species distribution. Some animals and plants may move to cooler areas, disrupting those complex food webs in the ecosystem. All of this can lead to reduced biodiversity. Some species may become extinct if they can't adapt. And an impact on food production. Some areas may become too hot or too dry for crops, and this could lead to food shortages. And a change to migration patterns. As animals might find it harder to survive in certain regions, some birds may move to cooler regions if their usual habitats get too warm or too cold potentially, if the extreme weather is disrupting their breeding and mating cycles. Global warming is having really serious consequences on nearly all ecosystems on Earth. And human activity is the main contributing factor towards increased global warming.
Make sure to like the video and subscribe. Click that bell notification so you get notified of any future videos. And also give us a comment. Let me know what you want to see next. Also, check out that link in the description to get your free flashcards to help your revision. And the link for my resources for all of your free study notes and access to that exam masterclass so you can join me the night before your exam. See you in the next video.